The Duke of Blackwood, Alistair Beaumont, regarded the arrangement as he would a necessary, if unpleasant, root canal. It was a transaction, a cold piece of marital commerce designed to stanch the bleeding of an estate his father had nearly gambled into oblivion. The woman, a Miss Eleanor Vance, was the daughter of some city magnate who had amassed a fortune in shipping and, more importantly, had died without a male heir. She possessed an obscene amount of money, and he possessed a title that stretched back 400 years. It was, his solicitor Mr. Harding had assured him, a perfect symbiosis. He had met her twice. The first time was a stilted affair in Harding's London offices, a room that smelled of old paper and sealing wax. She had been dressed in a modest gray dress that seemed designed to absorb light rather than reflect it. She was not plain, precisely, but she was profoundly unmemorable. Her hair was a simple brown, her eyes a shade of hazel that revealed nothing, and she had a habit of looking at a point just past his shoulder, as if more interested in the wallpaper. She had spoken only when spoken to, her voice a low, even murmur. The second meeting had been at a formal dinner, chaperoned by her whey-faced aunt. He had tried to engage her in conversation, speaking of art, of politics, of the London season. Her responses were concise, intelligent, and utterly devoid of passion or personality. She was a well-educated automaton, a repository of correct facts and acceptable opinions. He felt no spark, no interest, not even a flicker of irritation. He felt nothing. She was a condition of his solvency, a name to be affixed to his own. He returned to his club that evening and, over a glass of brandy, penned a letter to his friend, Lord Fitzwilliam, a man who understood the grim necessities of their class. He dipped his pen, the scratching of the nib the only sound in the quiet library. "The deed is all but done," he wrote. "I am to be shackled to a Miss Vance, who is less a woman and more a walking ledger book. She is a mouse of a woman, quiet and gray and utterly devoid of spirit. Still, the price is right, and Blackwood Manor will be saved from the creditors. She brings nothing to this marriage but her dowry, and even that is managed by men of business I shall never have to meet. A small price to pay for survival, I suppose." He folded the letter, sealed it with wax, and sent it off with a footman, the words already fading from his mind. They were a momentary exhalation of frustration, nothing more. A private complaint to a trusted friend. He gave the woman herself no further thought. She was a solution, not a person. The wedding was a perfunctory ceremony at St. George's, Hanover Square. Eleanor stood beside him, a figure in white silk, her face obscured by a veil. She made her vows in that same quiet, controlled voice. He made his in a tone of crisp finality. When he lifted the veil to kiss her, he saw her eyes for a brief, clear moment. They were not vacant. They were watchful. It was a fleeting, unsettling impression, gone as soon as it registered. He brushed his lips against hers. They were cool and unresponsive. The transaction was complete. They removed to Blackwood Manor the following day. The ancestral home was a sprawling Jacobean masterpiece, but its grandeur was that of a beautiful woman fallen on hard times. Dust motes danced in the weak afternoon light, tracing patterns over shrouded furniture. The gardens were a riot of weeds, the great conservatory a skeleton of grimy glass and rusted iron. His father's neglect was a palpable presence, a film of decay over everything Alistair held dear. He showed Eleanor to her rooms, a suite of chambers overlooking the blighted east lawn. "I trust you will find this satisfactory," he said, the words stiff and formal. She walked to the window, her gloved hand resting on the sill. "The view has potential," she said, her voice betraying no judgment, merely observation. He left her there, relieved to be alone. He retreated to his study, the one room he had managed to keep in some semblance of order, though even it was succumbing to entropy. Piles of unanswered correspondence teetered on the desk. Ledgers lay open, their columns of red ink a testament to his desperation. He poured a brandy, sank into his leather chair, and felt the familiar weight of his inheritance settle upon him. He had sold his name to save his home. He hoped, grimly, that it would be worth it. For the first week, the new Duchess of Blackwood was a ghost in her own home. She took her meals, sometimes with him in a vast and silent dining room, sometimes alone in her chambers. She walked the grounds, a solitary figure in a dark pelisse, her expression unreadable from a distance. She was present, and she was absent. She was there, and she was not there. Alistair was content with this arrangement. Her invisibility was a small mercy. It allowed him to pretend that nothing had fundamentally changed, that he was still the master of his own life, unencumbered by a wife he had not chosen. He wrestled with the estate papers, the tenant complaints, the endless demands for repairs and funds he did not have. He was drowning in details. Then, a small, inexplicable change occurred. He entered his study one morning to find it different. The teetering piles of paper were gone. In their place were neat, ordered stacks, each weighted down with a polished stone from the riverbank. The ledgers were closed, a slip of paper marking his place in each one. A faint scent of lemon and beeswax hung in the air. He stood in the doorway, baffled. He summoned the housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, a woman who had served his family for 40 years and whose face was a permanent mask of weary disapproval. "Who tidied my study?" he demanded. Mrs. Gable's expression did not change. "Her Grace, your Grace." Alistair stared. "The Duchess? Why?" "She said she was looking for a book and could not abide the chaos," the housekeeper replied, a flicker of something unidentifiable in her eyes. "She has a gift for order, it would seem." He dismissed her with a wave of his hand, his mind churning. He walked to the desk. The organization was not merely tidy, it was intelligent. Correspondence was sorted by urgency. Bills were separated from receipts. A particularly tangled dispute with a tenant farmer over water rights had its relevant documents clipped together, a single sheet on top summarizing the core issue in a clear, concise hand he did not recognize. It was her handwriting, neat, angular, and ruthlessly efficient. He felt a prickle of something he could not name. It was not gratitude. It was closer to annoyance, a feeling of being trespassed upon, of his private chaos being invaded and subdued by this quiet, gray woman. He had not asked for her help. He did not want it. A few days later, another anomaly. He was walking down the long gallery when he heard music. It was a piece by Scarlatti, complex and fiery, played with a precision and passion that was startling. The sound drew him toward the music room, a chamber that had been silent for years. The pianoforte was old and slightly out of tune, but the hands that flew across the keys were masterful. He peered through the crack of the door. It was Eleanor. Her back was to him, her posture erect, her focus absolute. The music poured from her, a torrent of feeling and complexity that seemed utterly at odds with the subdued woman he knew. He watched, hidden, for a full 10 minutes, mesmerized by the contradiction. The woman who spoke in monotones and dressed in shades of dust could produce this river of sound. When the piece concluded, she sat for a moment in the ringing silence, her shoulders slumping slightly, as if the effort had drained her. Then she rose, closed the lid of the pianoforte, and left the room by another door. He never mentioned it. He did not know how. It was another piece of the puzzle of her that did not fit the simple picture he had constructed. Their conversations, when they happened, began to shift. One evening, staring into the fire, he voiced his frustration over the estate's failing wool production. "The yield is down, the price is worse, and the merchants in Bristol are squeezing me dry," he grumbled, more to himself than to her. From across the cavernous drawing room, she spoke, her voice calm and even. "The problem is not the yield, it is the process. You sell the raw fleece." He looked over at her. "Of course I sell the raw fleece. It is what we have always done. The weavers in the valley pay the Bristol merchants a premium for Blackwood wool," she continued, as if stating a simple fact. "The merchants take a third of the value simply for transporting it 20 miles. If you were to wash and card the wool here and sell it directly to the weavers, you would eliminate the middleman and increase your profit by a quarter, even after accounting for the labor." He stared at her, dumbfounded. The logic was so simple, so painfully obvious, that he could not believe he had never considered it. He had been so focused on the grand, intractable problems that he had missed the practical, solvable ones. "How do you know this?" he asked, his tone sharper than he intended. "My father did not make his fortune by allowing other men to take a third of his profit for work he could do himself," she said simply. She picked up her embroidery, and the conversation was over. He was stunned into silence. A mouse, he had called her, a walking ledger book. But the mouse had teeth of logic, and the ledger book contained a wisdom his 400-year-old title could not supply. A strange and unwelcome feeling began to coalesce within him, a nascent respect. It was an uncomfortable sensation, one that unsettled the foundations of the neat, transactional world he had built around their marriage. He preferred her as a ghost, a quiet absence. This emerging presence, with her sharp mind and hidden talents, was a complication. He found himself watching her. He started to notice things. The way she listened to the tenant farmers, her head tilted, her questions precise. The way she managed the household staff, not with commands, but with quiet suggestions that were invariably adopted. The house ran more smoothly. The meals improved. A sense of quiet industry began to replace the air of stagnant decay. She was bringing order from chaos, life from neglect. She was, in a very real sense, saving his home just as surely as her dowry was saving his finances. And he had never once said, "Thank you." This slow, dawning awareness was what made the discovery so devastating. It happened on a rainy Tuesday, nearly a month after their wedding. He had been searching his desk for a misplaced deed, growing more frustrated by the second, even though the desk was now a model of organization. He shuffled through a folder of personal correspondence, and there it was, the draft of his letter to Fitzwilliam. He had forgotten he had even kept it. He was about to toss it into the fire when he noticed something. A faint crease down the center that was not his own. He had folded it in thirds to fit the envelope. This had been folded in half, and then in half again. Delicately, precisely. A cold dread, sharp and sudden, pierced through him. He sank into his chair, the paper trembling in his hand. He unfolded it and read his own words, his own arrogant, dismissive prose. "She is a mouse of a woman, quiet and gray and utterly devoid of spirit. She brings nothing to this marriage but her dowry." She had seen it. She had been in his study, bringing her quiet order to his chaotic life, and she had found this testament to his casual cruelty. She had read it. She had folded it neatly, this little paper bomb, and placed it back where she had found it. And she had said nothing. Nothing at all. The realization struck him not like a lightning bolt, but like a slow, creeping poison. He thought about her silence. He thought about her watchfulness. He thought about the music that had filled the house, and then, just as suddenly, stopped a week ago. He had not even truly registered its absence until this very moment. The house had been silent. Anaphora of memory struck him. He thought about the cool, unresponsive kiss at the altar. He thought about her speaking of his estate's potential with a voice devoid of emotion. He thought about the invisible wall between them at the dinner table, a barrier he had been grateful for, never questioning its source. It was not shyness. It was not a lack of spirit. It was armor. She had read his assessment of her, his dismissal of her entire being, and she had wrapped herself in a cloak of quiet dignity and carried on. She had continued to run his household, to solve his problems, to salvage the wreckage of his inheritance, all while knowing that he considered her to be nothing more than a bank draft in a gray dress. Shame, hot and suffocating, washed over him. It was a novel sensation. Alistair Beaumont, Duke of Blackwood, was not a man given to shame. He was a man of pride, of duty, of pragmatism. But the callousness of his words, laid bare before the evidence of her quiet competence, was indefensible. He was not just wrong, he was a fool, a blind, arrogant fool. He sat there for a long time, the letter in his hand, the rain lashing against the window panes. The silence of the house pressed in on him. It was no longer a peaceful silence. It was an accusatory one. It was the sound of her absence. He had to find her. He stood, his movements stiff. He left the study and walked through the long, quiet corridors of his home. It felt alien to him now, a place he lived in but did not understand. He checked the drawing room, the morning room, her empty suite. She was nowhere to be found. Mrs. Gable was polishing silver in the butler's pantry, her movements rhythmic and practiced. "Where is the Duchess?" he asked, his voice strained. The housekeeper looked up, her expression unreadable. "Her Grace is often in the conservatory at this hour, Your Grace." Of course. The conservatory. The great, ruined glass house at the back of the manor, a place he had avoided for years because it was the most potent symbol of his family's decline. He strode down the hallway and pushed open the heavy, warped door. The air inside was damp and smelled of earth and decay. Rain hammered on the grimy glass roof, and water dripped from a dozen different leaks, pooling on the cracked flagstones. Weeds grew thick and tangled, choking the life out of the few hardy, neglected plants that remained. And there she was. She was standing in the center of the ruin, wearing practical gloves and holding a pair of rusty shears. She was not looking at the chaos around her. She was focused on a single, stubborn rosebush, its stem thick with thorns and neglect, which had managed to produce one perfect, defiant white bloom. She was carefully, methodically, trimming away the dead wood around it. She did not seem to have heard him enter. She was entirely absorbed in her task, a small, quiet figure of purpose in a world of decay. He watched her for a moment, the image searing itself into his mind. The one living, beautiful thing in the wreckage, and the woman who was trying to save it. "Eleanor," he said. Her name felt strange on his tongue. He had never used it before. She flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of her shoulders, but she did not turn around. She snipped another dead branch. The sound was sharp in the damp air. He walked toward her, his boots crunching on fallen leaves and broken terracotta. He stopped a few feet away. "I found the letter," he said, the words tasting like ash. "The one I wrote to Fitzwilliam." She remained perfectly still, her back to him. The rain drummed on the glass. "I know you read it," he continued, his voice low and raw. "I know, because you are the most orderly person I have ever met, and you folded it differently than I did." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of the rain and the dripping water. He could see the tension in her posture, the rigid line of her spine. He took another step closer. "I have spent the last hour sitting in my study, a place you made functional, in a house you are slowly rescuing from ruin, thinking about how you solved a problem with my wool production that I was too blind to see. And I read what I wrote." He paused, forcing himself to say the next words. "I was wrong." It was a wholly inadequate phrase for the depth of his folly. "I was a blind, arrogant fool," he said, the confession tearing from him. "What I wrote, it was not just an error in judgment. It was a failure of perception, a complete and utter failure to see what was right in front of me." She finally turned. Her face was pale, her hazel eyes clear and deep and utterly unclouded by tears. They held his gaze, and for the first time, he did not look away. He saw in them not anger, but a profound, weary sadness. "And what is it you believe you see now, Your Grace?" she asked, her voice quiet but laced with an edge of steel he had never heard before. "I see a woman of formidable intelligence," he said, the words coming in a rush. "I see a woman of immense talent and quiet strength. I see the person who is holding this entire estate together. I see the music in the silence. I see the order in the chaos. I see you." A single, perfect tear escaped her control and traced a path down her cheek. She did not wipe it away. "You saw a transaction," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "A solution to a financial problem. You saw a mouse." "I was wrong," he repeated, his own voice thick with an emotion he could not name. "Eleanor, He trailed off, unsure of what he could possibly offer her. An apology felt like a paltry insult. He took a decisive step. He would not ask for forgiveness. He would act. "I am going to London," he said abruptly. "Tomorrow." She watched him, her expression shifting from sorrow to confusion. "Why?" "I have a meeting with my solicitor," he said. "There are some things about our arrangement that I suddenly find I need to understand completely." He also had a visit to pay to Lord Fitzwilliam, a conversation that would be far less pleasant for his friend than their last correspondence. He would cauterize the wound of his disrespect at its source. He turned and left the conservatory, leaving her standing there beside the single white rose, the rusty shears still clutched in her hand. The air outside felt clean and cold, and for the first time in his life, Alistair Beaumont, Duke of Blackwood, had no idea what he was going to do next, only that everything depended on it. The journey to London was a torment of self-recrimination. Every mile that passed, every field and hedgerow that blurred past the carriage window, was a testament to his own profound blindness. He replayed their entire acquaintance in his mind, but this time he saw it through new eyes. He saw her quiet assessments, her patient observations, her subtle, unthanked efforts. He had mistaken dignity for dullness, self-possession for a lack of spirit. His first stop was not his club nor his London residence, but the dusty, paper-choked offices of Mr. Harding. The solicitor, a man as dry and precise as the legal documents he drafted, looked up in surprise as the Duke was announced. "Your Grace," Harding said, rising. "This is unexpected. Is there a problem?" "Yes, Mr. Harding, there is a problem," Alistair said, closing the door firmly behind him. "The problem is my own ignorance. I wish to understand the full terms of my marriage settlement, not the summary you provided me, every clause, every condition, and most importantly, I wish to know the identity of the lender who holds the mortgage to Blackwood." Harding's face became a careful, professional mask. He gestured for Alistair to sit. "Your Grace, the terms of the agreement were quite clear. The settlement of your debts was contingent upon the marriage. Her Grace's dowry was placed in a trust, the proceeds of which have been used to satisfy your creditors and consolidate the remaining debt under a single, manageable mortgage." "Held by whom?" Alistair insisted, leaning forward. "You told me it was a consortium of city bankers." The solicitor cleared his throat, a small, nervous sound. "That was the impression I was instructed to give, Your Grace. The lender insisted on absolute anonymity. It was a primary condition of the entire arrangement. And you, as my solicitor, agreed to this." Alistair's voice was sharp. "I agreed to it as the only viable path to saving your estate from being broken up and sold," Harding countered, his own voice firming. "It was, if I may be so bold, an act of unprecedented generosity on the lender's part. The interest rate is nominal, the terms exceedingly favorable." Alistair's mind was racing, connecting dots he hadn't even known existed. The insistence on anonymity, the favorable terms, the quiet competence of his wife, a woman whose father had been a master of finance. A dreadful, humbling certainty began to dawn. "It was her, wasn't it?" he said, the words barely a whisper. "The dowry was not simply a dowry. It was a fund she controlled. She didn't just bring money to this marriage. She is the banker. She holds the mortgage to my home." Mr. Harding's professional mask did not slip, but his eyes, for a fraction of a second, showed a deep and abiding respect. Not for the Duke, but for the Duchess. He did not confirm or deny it. He simply looked down at his desk and said, "The Duchess is a very shrewd and very private woman, Your Grace. She learned from a master." The confirmation was in the silence. It was in the solicitor's careful evasion. Alistair sat back in his chair as if struck. The full, staggering scale of his folly was now laid bare. He had not merely married an heiress. He had married his benefactor, his creditor, the silent architect of his salvation. And he had written, in his own hand, that she brought nothing to the marriage. The irony was so bitter it felt like poison. He had mocked the very person who held the power to ruin him, a power she had never once even hinted at wielding. He had called her a mouse who owned the house, the larder, and the very ground the cat stood on. He left Harding's office in a daze. The shame he had felt before was now compounded by a dizzying sense of awe. He walked the London streets without seeing them, his mind locked on the image of Eleanor in the ruined conservatory, carefully tending a single rose. Her quiet, constant, unacknowledged labor. His next stop was his club, where he knew he was likely to find Fitzwilliam. He found him in the card room, holding court with a group of vapid young lords. Fitzwilliam greeted him with a lazy smile. "Blackwood, back from your rural exile. How is the little bride? Tame yet?" Alistair felt a surge of cold fury. He walked directly to the table and looked down at his friend, his face a mask of stone. Fitzwilliam, I received your reply to my letter. I found your comments regarding my wife to be ill-judged and offensive. Fitzwilliam blinked, taken aback. Here now, Alistair. I was only echoing your own sentiments. Mouse of a woman, wasn't it? It was, Alistair said, his voice dangerously low. And it was the single most foolish and contemptible thing I have ever written. The Duchess of Blackwood is a woman of more intelligence, character, and substance than you could comprehend in 1,000 lifetimes. Her name is not to be spoken in this room, or by you, ever again. Do you understand me? The room had fallen silent. Every eye was on them. Fitzwilliam's face flushed a blotchy red. You dare speak to me that way after you came whining to me in your letter? I am correcting an error, Alistair said, his voice cutting through the tension. A profound one. And I am informing you that my friendship is not available to those who would disparage my wife. We are concluded. He turned his back on the stunned man and walked out of the club, the silence he left behind him more damning than any shout. It was a small act, a public declaration that changed nothing, and yet changed everything. It was the first brick in a new foundation. He returned to Blackwood Manor late the next night. The house was dark and quiet, save for a single light burning in the library. He found her there, curled in a large armchair, a book lying open in her lap, though he knew she was not reading. She looked up as he entered. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He did not approach her immediately. He stood in the doorway, taking in the scene. He was no longer just seeing a woman in a room. He was seeing layers of meaning. He was seeing the quiet strength it took for her to remain here, in his house, after his cruelty. He was seeing the resilience of a person who refused to be defined by his shallow judgment. I spoke with Mr. Harding, he began. She said nothing, her gaze remaining steady. I know everything, Eleanor, he said softly. I know that you are not just the Duchess. You are my creditor, my benefactor, the sole reason this house and this family have not been scattered to the winds. Her composure finally broke. She flinched, a look of deep, painful vulnerability crossing her features before she masked it again. It was a business arrangement, she whispered. The terms were intended to be private. It stopped being a business arrangement the moment I humiliated you, he countered, stepping into the room. You held all the power, yet you never used it. You had every right to foreclose, to ruin me, to walk away. Instead, you started organizing my study. You started tending the garden. He stopped before her chair. Why? She looked away from him, toward the fire. Blackwood is my home now. I do not invest in things I am willing to let fail. Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. She had invested in him. She had invested in his broken-down home, his failing estate, his tarnished legacy. And he had repaid her with contempt. This is no longer about the mortgage, he said, his voice thick with emotion. That is just money. This is about us, if there can even be an us. He knelt before her chair, an act of supplication that felt entirely natural, entirely necessary. He was no longer a duke addressing his duchess. He was a man laid bare before the woman he had wronged. I cannot undo what I wrote, he said. I cannot erase the fact that I was blind. But I can promise you this. I will spend the rest of my life learning to see. I will spend the rest of my days being worthy of the faith you placed in this estate, worthy of the woman who saw potential in the ruin. He did not ask for her forgiveness. He did not ask for her love. He simply made a vow. Eleanor looked down at him, her hazel eyes glistening. She did not offer him her hand. She did not smile. She simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was not absolution. It was not acceptance. It was permission. Permission for him to try. The days that followed were a study in quiet negotiation. There was no grand reconciliation, no sudden reversal. The wall between them remained, but now Alistair was the one patiently, painstakingly trying to dismantle it, brick by brick. He did not demand her company. He earned it. He began by joining her in the conservatory. He did not offer grand pronouncements or try to take over. He simply appeared one morning in old clothes, holding a pair of heavy shears. "Show me what to do," he said. She looked at him, surprised, then pointed to a thicket of ancient, choking ivy that was pulling down one of the iron support beams. "Start there," she instructed. And so he did. For hours, they worked in a shared silence, the only sounds the snipping of shears, the scrape of tools against stone, and their own breathing. It was hard, punishing work. His hands, accustomed to holding reins and brandy glasses, were soon raw and blistered. But he did not stop. Every vine he tore down, every weed he pulled, felt like an act of penance. After a few days of this shared labor, she began to speak. Not of their situation, but of the plants. She pointed out a dormant orchid that could be saved, a species of fern that needed a different kind of soil. He listened, truly listened, absorbing the information, asking questions. He learned that her knowledge of botany was as formidable as her understanding of finance. She spoke of the plants with a quiet affection, a tenderness he had never heard in her voice before. He was not just clearing a garden, he was being given a lesson in how to care for things. His next overture was at the dinner table. The vast, silent expanse of polished mahogany had become a symbol of their estrangement. One evening, he instructed the footman to set only 2 places, side by side, at one end of the table. When she entered, she stopped, her eyes taking in the change. I am tired of shouting across a football pitch," he said simply, pulling out her chair. She hesitated for a moment, then sat. The proximity was unnerving at first. He could feel the warmth from her, smell the faint, clean scent of soap and lavender. He did not force conversation. He spoke of the estate, but this time he did not complain. He presented problems as puzzles they might solve together. "The north fields are lying fallow," he said, passing her the salt. "They're too waterlogged. I was thinking of digging drainage ditches." She considered this for a moment. "That would be expensive," she said, "and the clay soil is heavy. Why not plant them with something that thrives in wet ground? Willows, perhaps. You could harvest them for basket weaving. There's a demand for it in the village." He looked at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Of course," he said. "Of course." It became their new ritual. He would bring her the problems of the estate, and she, with her sharp, practical mind, would help him find the solutions. He was no longer the sole, burdened duke. They were becoming partners. He began to look forward to their dinners, to the quiet interplay of their minds. He began to see the dry wit that lay beneath her reserve, the flicker of amusement in her eyes when he said something particularly foolish. He found the sheet music for the Scarlatti sonatas she had played and left it on the pianoforte. He did not ask her to play. He simply made it available. For a week, the music room remained silent. He began to fear he had presumed too much. Then, one afternoon, as he was walking past, he heard the first hesitant notes. He stopped, holding his breath. She was playing again. But this time, It was not the fiery, passionate piece from before. It was a slow, contemplative nocturne by Chopin, filled with a searching, poignant melancholy. He did not hide and watch. He walked to the doorway and simply stood there, leaning against the frame, allowing the music to wash over him, a message far more eloquent than words. When she finished, she did not startle. She knew he was there. She turned her head and looked at him, her hands still resting on the keys. "It's beautiful," he said softly. "It is sad," she replied. "Perhaps," he acknowledged, "but it is not silent." A month turned into 2, then 3. The conservatory began to show signs of life. New panes of glass replaced the broken ones. The ironwork was scraped of rust and repainted a deep forest green. Together they planted new seedlings, their hands brushing as they worked in the rich, dark earth. The single white rose was now surrounded by a dozen other bushes, all pruned and healthy. He started to learn her. He learned she preferred tea to coffee, morning light to afternoon sun, books of history to novels. He learned she had a fear of thunderstorms and a surprising fondness for the ugliest of the stray dogs that hung around the kitchens, a scruffy terrier she had named Horace. He, in turn, began to change. The arrogant, detached Duke was slowly being eroded, replaced by a man who was more thoughtful, more patient, more humble. He found he was less interested in the opinions of men like Fitzwilliam and more interested in whether he could make his wife smile. It was a rare occurrence, a small, fleeting quirk of her lips, but when it happened, it felt like the sun breaking through the clouds. The turning point, the moment the last brick in the wall crumbled, came not with a grand gesture, but a small one. He had been reviewing the quarterly accounts, which, for the first time in a decade, showed a modest profit. Her strategies, the wool, the willows, a dozen other small efficiencies, were working. The estate was breathing again. He looked across the library at her. She was reading, a slight frown of concentration on her face, her spectacles perched on her nose. A wave of emotion so powerful it almost buckled him, swept through him. It was not just respect. It was not just gratitude. It was a deep, aching love, a feeling as solid and real as the oak shelves that surrounded them. He went to her and gently took the book from her hands. "Alistair?" she asked, startled. He knelt before her, just as he had that first night, but this time, it was not in shame. It was in reverence. He took her hand, the one that had been blistered from working in the garden, the one that had penned the notes that saved his ledgers, the one that could coax such beauty from the pianoforte. "When we married," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "I entered into a transaction. I wish to renegotiate the terms." Her eyes widened, a flicker of the old fear in them. "What terms?" "My letter was wrong about everything, but it was most wrong about what you bring to this marriage," he said, his gaze locked with hers. "You did not bring a dowry. You brought intelligence and grace and resilience. You brought music and order. You brought life back to this house. You brought everything. The only thing you did not bring was a husband worthy of you." He lifted her hand to his lips. "I love you, Eleanor. I am not sure when it happened, but it is the most profound truth of my life. I love you. And so I am proposing a new contract, one that has nothing to do with mortgages or titles, one that is based on this." He placed her hand over his heart. "My life, my devotion, my admiration, all freely given for the rest of our days, if you will have them." Tears streamed freely down her face now, but they were not tears of sorrow. She looked at the man kneeling before her, his pride stripped away, his heart offered up with a humility she never thought possible. Her other hand came up to cup his cheek. "The terms are acceptable, Your Grace," she whispered, and then, for the first time, she smiled. A real, radiant smile that lit up her entire face and chased away the last of the shadows. Alistair. A year later, the Duke of Blackwood stood in the conservatory. It was no longer a ruin. It was a paradise of glass and green, teeming with life. Sunlight streamed through the clean panes, illuminating the vibrant colors of orchids and hibiscus. The air was warm and fragrant. In the center, where a single, stubborn rose had once grown, there was now a lush bed of white blossoms. He was not alone. Eleanor was beside him, her head resting on his shoulder. Her form was fuller now, her hand resting protectively on the gentle swell of her stomach. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with music, with laughter, with the bustling sounds of a prosperous and happy home. He looked down at his wife, at the woman he had once dismissed as a gray mouse. He saw the fire in her eyes, the keen intelligence in her smile, the deep well of love she had so patiently waited to give. He had thought he was buying his salvation, a cold transaction to secure his legacy. He had been wrong. He had not bought anything. He had been given a gift, the gift of being truly seen by someone, which, in turn, had finally taught him how to see. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, her voice a low, happy murmur. He smiled, turning to press a soft kiss to her forehead. "I was thinking," he said, "about how a man can be surrounded by treasure and be too blind to see it, and how lucky he is if he is given a second chance to open his eyes." She looked up at him, her love a tangible presence between them. "He is lucky indeed," she agreed, and as he drew her closer, the late afternoon sun cast their long shadows across the floor. Two figures finally, irrevocably, entwined as one. The house was safe, the debts were gone, but the greatest profit, he knew, was this. It was the quiet, unassailable wealth of a love that had been earned. If you made it to the end of this journey with Alistair and Eleanor, thank you for listening. Tell me in the comments, if you were Eleanor, what one condition would you have added to their new contract? I love reading your thoughts. Please consider leaving a like and subscribe for more stories of love, loss, and the quiet revolutions of the heart. Our next story is a tantalizing one. A governess with a secret past, a widowed earl consumed by grief, and a locked nursery that holds the key to their future. They arrive here, at the heart of the story, whenever they are ready,